All right, so from Skibbereen to the moon, here we go. Something completely different. Wandering around Skibbereen, shortly after we got here, I came across this curious plaque on the wall of a house in Skibbereen on Bridge Street, and I thought, now, who are these people? Who are the Clerke sisters? Found other signs, Clark Lane, what was this all about? And we all know, of course, Miss Clark's shop on Bridge Street, still there, traditional shop, wonderful place. So I thought, well, it's obviously a very old Clerke family, and I came across this grave up in the Church Lane graveyard. The Clerkes, this is the grave of Sinjin Clerke, who was the grandfather of Agnes. Clerkes were an established Skibbereen family. Sinjin was a doctor. He was very esteemed locally. He was part of what was called the liberal Protestants of Skibbereen. He was pro-emancipation, very benevolent. During the periodic famines that would hit West Cork, he was always at the forefront of relief efforts. Now, this is his son, John William. John William was a Trinity scholar. In fact, he studied classics at Trinity, but his real love was chemistry and astronomy and math and science. He married Catherine Mary Deasy. This is a picture of her in older age, but she was apparently very young, very accomplished, very beautiful and very accomplished, and she had been highly educated at the famous Ursuline convent in Cork. I was just reading the diaries of Asenath Nicholson recently, and she visited this Ursuline convent and described it as a sort of a heaven on earth for young girls. So unlike most young Catholic girls at the time, she herself was highly educated, very accomplished, spoke several languages, a talented musician. Even into her 80s, she loved to play the harp and sing Irish airs. She was very high-minded and came from a wealthy family. The Deasys, and any of you who are familiar with Clonakilty, of course, know about the Deasy Brewing Company. The Deasys were an old Clonakilty family. They had made their fortune in Jamaica from previous generations, and the current Deasy patriarch, his name was Rickard. He was Catherine's father, and he became the first Catholic magistrate in Cork. Now, his son Rickard, also called Rickard, and there was a long line of Rickards, went off to Trinity with John William Clerke. They became best friends, introduced him to his sister Catherine, and Catherine and John William got married, and they settled in Skib because John William had a job as a bank manager. And Skibbereen at the time, this is the 1840s Ordnance Survey map. Skibbereen at the time really was laid out essentially as it is now. Bridge Street was called New Street, and the house was located right along here with lovely gardens going back to the river, and so the children would have had lovely views from their windows. The accommodation was grand. This is the original bank. It was the provincial bank. The accommodation was very grand. This, in its day, and this associated house beside it, was one of the nicest houses in Skibbereen, one of the biggest, largest, and very gracious. And it's still gracious when you go in. It's now La Femme Beauty Salon, but when you go in, you'll see immediately that there are these remains of this wonderful house. And the children had, with a fabulous staircase, and the children had a very nice growing up. Life was gracious, life was good. There were servants. The children started to come along. Ellen was born in 1840, Agnes in 1842, and Aubrey in 1843. Now, the father was Protestant, the mother was Catholic. All the children grew up in the Catholic faith, and to the end of their lives, they were very devout, practicing Catholics. The girls were educated entirely at home by their parents. And as you can imagine, both highly educated parents. They had a good education, and with languages and music from the mother, and from the father, science, mathematics. And she described it as having free run of his library and drinking up everything. It was a great advertisement, as Nicola wants me to say. Where are you, Nikki? for homeschooling. Great advertisement for homeschooling. Now, Aubrey eventually went off. This is a picture of him as a young man. He eventually went off to Carlow College, which was one of the few educational institutions for the sons of Catholic, middle classes. Bridge Street was essentially like this still. This is from the Lawrence collection. So this photograph was taken in 1900. But essentially, this is what it looked like in the 1840s. Here's the building with those lovely sort of eyebrows over the... And the difference is that here you can see the railway going through. And, of course, that wasn't there when the Clerkes lived there. And, of course, life was gracious, but there was also the other half. And that was up on Windmill Hill, the hovels, the cottages were filled with the poor. And, of course, you know what came next, and that is that the Great Famine hit in 1845. And although we've learned a lot about how life in some ways went on through the horror, the horror was very much real for the Clerkes. John William himself headed up the relief efforts. He, as his father before him, he took charge of the fundraising efforts for the relief committee. He was the secretary, selling the tickets to benevolent people who would then give them to the poor to come to the soup kitchen to be fed. Gathered the subscriptions and pleaded for government assistance. As the famine wore on, this is the soup kitchen itself. As the famine wore on, John William himself succumbed to famine fever, and he was gravely, gravely ill for several months, hovering between life and death. Now, life at the time, the Clerkes were living in the door. The bank sent a replacement, whose name I don't know, but he wrote a letter back to the bank saying, please use it however you want to. This letter was forwarded to government. It became part of official records. And he said that... he gave a shocking account, really, of dead bodies in the street, dead bodies on carts being taken off to funerals, skeletal people besieging the bank every day and having to hire guards to keep them from the bank. And as I said, his quotation was used in official accounts. Now, what we don't know is how did the children make it through this time? What's one of the amazing things is that they all wrote as adults. It never appeared in any of the accounts, and yet it must have been completely traumatizing for them. Their father gravely ill, what was going on outside their door. One account I read, and only one, said that John William eventually recuperated by going to Italy. So it's quite possible that the whole family fled. Others, they wouldn't have gone to Clonakilty. That was just as bad, and some of their cousins, in fact, died of famine fever. Now, interestingly, the exact same events had an impact, a huge impact on O'Donovan Rossa, who was in Skibbereen at the same time. His father, you probably know all this, his father had died on the border work scheme. His mother had taken the rest of the family, all except for him. He stayed with an aunt in Skibbereen and fled to America. So his family was decimated. It had the effect on him of completely radicalizing him, and he basically went to his grave angry and determined that he would defeat the tyranny that had led to this situation. Interestingly, though, it didn't have the same effect on the Clerkes. They remained unionist for the rest of their life, very committed unionists. So very interesting that these two eminent individuals from the same cauldron came out with very opposite views, both wanting the best for Ireland as they saw it, both seeing themselves as very patriotic Irish people. Now, once he was home and life could resume its normal tenor, one of the things, the education of the children continued. John Williams set up a telescope. He was a keen amateur archaeologist. The telescope would have looked exactly like this. He set it up in the back garden, and it was equipped with a chronograph. And the chronograph timed the transit of the stars across the meridian, and then with the aid of those tables, he could calculate the exact time. And he would put this on a clock in the town, in the bank window, and thus kept time for the whole of Skibbereen. So he was the Skibbereen timekeeper at this time. Now, as Agnes said in what little we have left of her own writings, she enjoyed the run of her father's library. And this was one of his books, The Outlines of Astronomy. It was in her father's library. Agnes had mastered this book by the time she was 11. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was 11, I wanted the Beano Annual for Christmas. She was 11. Obviously, this was a genius, a very bright family. Thank you, Agnes. Yes, glad you approve. And the library was obviously extremely well-stocked with the science and math books of the time. And when the family eventually left Skibbereen in 1861, a grateful community presented these 4 books to John William Clerke. And they're inscribed with the gratitude of the community. They're highly scientific books. And they're currently residing in the Heritage Centre. So they went with the Clerkes. They eventually passed down to the DC relatives that were left, and the DCs presented them back to Skibbereen when the book on Agnes Clerke was published in 2000, I believe. And it's great to have them here. There's a real tangible evidence. So this was the book then that she moved on to, and here was her further study. She had mastered this one by the time she was 19. Now, meanwhile, Aubrey had gone off and was studying mathematics, and he became her math tutor. Now, around this time, the 1860s, Rickard DC, John Williams' friend and Catherine's brother, was appointed the Baron of the Exchequer Court, which is one of the 4 courts in Dublin, and he was able to appoint his own registrar, and he chose his brother-in-law, John William. And so the whole family left Skibbereen at that point. They had been here. John William grew up here. They were West Cork. They had all this family connections. At this point, they left. They moved to Dublin for several years. There's some suggestion they also lived in Queenstown or Cove for a while. And they, as far as we know, never came back to Skibbereen after that. In fact, we're not even sure if they came back to Ireland after that. Some evidence that they may have, some that they didn't. So Rickard and his family lived in Merrion Square and had a country house. The country house was in Black Rock, and it was called Carysfort. In fact, my sister went to school there for a while. And they were very involved in the cultural life of the community at the time. This is their only son. His name was Henry Hugh Peter, known as HHPDC, who went on to become a Tibetan explorer. So here he is in his Tibetan explorer outfit, and then went on afterwards to found a motor car. It was called the DC Motor Car Company, and that's it. There he is with his motor car. And they remained close all their lives with their DC cousins. And in fact, what archive there is of original material is held by the DC family. And I was given access to that earlier this year, which was wonderful to be able to interact with some of the original documents. When in Dublin, they lived at Herbert Place, nice leafy accommodation right next to the canal, and the girls took to studying in the National Library, very congenial, and they would have interacted with all the sort of the social scene at the time, which included the Wilds, the Petries, that sort of antiquarian movement, the mythology movement. The Celtic revival at the time was in full swing. Aubrey was now in Trinity, and he would bring home his fellow students. Especially, he had several friends who later became astronomers, and those connections were kept up. He was barred from obtaining a fellowship at Trinity in maths because he was Catholic, and so he decided to go into the law instead, and he went on to become a barrister, and he specialized in conveyancing. And now, why is this guy here? How does he come into the story? Well, in his story, The Dead, in Dubliners, there are two sisters, and they're modelled on the two Miss Flynns, one of whom was James Joyce's grandmother, and they gave piano lessons, and the two sisters studied with the Miss Flynns. Now, around this time, Agnes, this is a picture of her as a young woman, and she was famously delicate. She needed to... her health was not good. It was always a little precarious. And so because of that, the mother decided that since Italy had been so good for in John Williams' recovery, that the family would move to Italy. Now, unfortunately, the family was the mother, Catherine, and the two daughters, Agnes and Ellen. John was busy at work, and Aubrey as a barrister. But they would come whenever they could. And so John William managed to get a lot of time visiting back and forth. And the three women went off, first of all, to Rome, and then they spent a couple of years in Rome. And from 1867 to 1877, so 10 years, they lived in Italy. First of all in Rome, and then in Florence. And Florence had this magnificent system of public libraries, and the girls became students in these public libraries. As you say in British universities, they read. They read widely. They became fluent in Italian. Fluent in several languages, in fact. They took to studying. For Ellen, it was classical Italian poetry was her big thrill, and for Agnes, it was the philosophy and sciences of the Renaissance. Now, one of the people that they ran into was Liszt, and the story was that they were walking along the road. They heard this wonderful piano playing coming out from a window. They stood, they listened, they applauded. He looked out the window, he greeted them, he brought them in, and he made Agnes play the piano for him. So that's just a little aside. One of the people that they ran into was Janet Ross. You could see she was head of the sort of expat community, and there was a huge Italian expat community, or a British expat community in Italy. It was very trendy at the time to live in Italy, and they became very good friends with Janet Duff Gordon Ross. She was very well connected, and she provided an introduction for Agnes to her cousin Henry Reeve. Now, after the end of this 10 years, the family moved back to London. John William retired. By now, Aubrey was in practice as a barrister in London. The whole family moved back together, and they lived in a house in Redcliffe Square in London. And they lived in that house for the rest of their lives. None of them ever married. None of them had children. They were, in Agnes's phrase, all in all to each other. They supported each other. They went to meetings, scientific meetings together. They all wrote. Agnes and Ellen both made their living from writing. You could do that in those days. And all their lives they wrote articles, they wrote books. In Ellen's case, she wrote a novel, not very well received novel, it has to be said, but they and made their living. And Aubrey also wrote not just about law, although he did write about law. So this was their life. This then became their lives. And the introduction. There's Aubrey at this time. He in his barrister's robes. Ellen Now, she mainly wrote on literature. She spoke several languages. She wrote for and edited something called the Dublin Magazine, which, despite being called the Dublin Magazine, was actually published in London. By this point, Agnes was in her mid-30s, and she was just about to embark on her career as a serious writer. She could be described as a polymath, and I looked this up in the dictionary just to make sure that this was the right word for Agnes. A polymath is a person whose expertise spans a significant number of different subject areas. Such a person is known to draw on complex bodies of knowledge to solve specific problems. If Agnes had been a man, she would have been called a Renaissance man. She was so widely read, so learned, and her knowledge spanned the arts and the sciences. Now, this is Henry Reeve. They became lifelong friends. She wrote to him. She said, I have some pieces that I've written if you would like to publish them in the Edinburgh Review, which was the most prestigious journal at the time. In fact, Perry O'Donovan has written a piece in the Skibbereen Journal that compares being published as a first-time publication, being published in the Edinburgh Review, to a complete unknown getting a short story accepted by the New Yorker. It was that much of a leap and that prestigious. Henry became a lifelong friend and supporter, and ever afterwards, she published at least 2 pieces every year in the Edinburgh Review. Now, in practically everything I've read about, and there has been a book, I'll show you the book that's been written about Agnes by Mary Brooke, so I'm not her only biographer by any means. It said that her first piece for the Edinburgh Review was a piece about Copernicus. That isn't true. Her first piece, in fact, was a review of 2 Italian books. And what were these books about? They were about the mafia. Brigandage in Sicily was the name of her piece. And that's what it was about. So this just shows how the breadth, of her knowledge. And so she was able to write a review of 2 Italian books about the brigands and the mafia, and the Victorian public gobbled it up. I mean, it fed into every preconceived notion they had about the Italians. So her next piece was about Copernicus, and it was more in line, of course, with her main interests. Copernicus in Italy was the name of the piece, and of course, he was the Renaissance scholar that first posited that the Earth revolved around the sun rather than the other way around. So the Edinburgh Review, as I said, was probably the most prestigious journal at the time. Here is the list of articles that she wrote for them, and just take a glance at the pure scope of. Now, the interesting thing is that your name was never published. There was no byline in the Edinburgh Review. This came from a list that she herself compiled when somebody asked her for one. And it was subsequently published in an appreciative, in a book by her and Ellen, a very small, slim volume by Lady Huggins, whom I'll mention in a minute. But, just an amazing array of articles. Now, her next venture was articles for Encyclopedia Britannica. She was recommended as a writer by Reeve, and eventually she published several articles on scientists, and these contributions were signed. Brooke, in her biography, says that her 9,000-word essay on Galileo, with an extensive bibliography, she described it as scholarly and even-handed dissertation on the life and work of this controversial genius, and it's her finest piece of work and still reads well after a century. And in fact, you can read online every piece that she wrote for the Encyclopedia Britannica and later on for the Dictionary of National Biography. Her piece on Laplace, who was mathematical genius, was highly mathematical and likely very much assisted by Aubrey in this. And then she wrote the piece on Mary Summerville. Now, Mary Summerville, and we're in Summerville country here, Mary Summerville was an early astronomer. From 1780 to 1872, she was also a polymath. She was an astronomer. She was the first woman to be admitted to membership of the Royal Astronomical Society, along with Caroline Herschel in 1835, and I'll talk about Caroline in a bit. In fact, the word scientist was coined to describe Mary Summerville, because you couldn't call her a man of science, which was the term at the time. So this brought her to public attention, all of this writing, and especially about women scientists. But what really, where she burst upon the scene, was with her publication of this book. And this is her magnum opus, and believe it or not, it is still in print. So the Popular History of Astronomy in the 19th Century, you can still buy it. You can still read, and it's a great read. Now, I know nothing about astrophysics, but I can read this. It's actually really readable. And she takes you she does this genius thing of teaching you a little bit, and then a little bit more, and then a little bit more, and then a little bit more. So by the end of the chapter, you've actually understood what you've read. It's amazing. This, we know, is the second edition. Not only because it says so, but also because there were no photographs in the first edition. Photographs only began with the second edition. Now, she spent 4 years writing this, but she had been planning it from the age of 15 and making her notes and sort of all the time, all her life to this point, this was the book she knew she was going to write. And it was an instant bestseller. Instant. It interested both lay people and amateurs and professionals, which is very unusual, as you can imagine. Serious students of astronomy loved it, and people like me who knew nothing. And one reviewer put it, quote, "On account of its accuracy and the really remarkable skill with which the leading points on which our knowledge has been increased are seized upon and set forth." It completely sold out in 2 months, went on to a second printing and an American edition, and it's never been out of print since. It was used as a standard textbook in all astronomy courses for years and on lists of recommended readings. It went into 4 editions, which she wrote, each of which she wrote, which was and discoveries were just galloping at this period. And so each of these editions was almost as much work as the first edition was. Monumental task to update it. Now, one of the 3 big advances that she expanded, of course, as the 19th century progressed, people learned more and more and more about celestial bodies. But there were 3 huge advances. The first one, and probably the most important, was the science of spectroscopy. The second one was the improvement in optics and therefore better telescopes. And the third one became the ability to actually photograph through the telescope. So those were the 3 huge advances. The spectroscope was really an incredible advance, because and Agnes's book was really the first widely read description of the significance of the spectroscope. So a spectroscope, as you can see, disperses light over a much, much wider band than a simple prism. And the pattern of colors is really important, as well as the black bands, and all indicate the presence of certain elements, such as oxygen, for example, or nitrogen. And the composition of the stars could now be studied for the first time, not just their appearance, not just the composition of the stars. Another huge advance was better optics. This is the Leviathan at Burr. Anybody here been to the Burr telescope? It's fantastic, isn't it? Robert and I went there last year, and Agnes has a whole chapter on the Burr telescope in which she tells about Lord Rosse and his young life and his interest, and he worked with the famous optic man Grubb, who had been at Trinity with Aubrey, to develop the largest telescope then in existence, and it's a really readable chapter in the book. And we visited there in 2016. It was a wonderful experience. Now, one of the things that Lord Rosse was particularly interested in was nebulae. And it was the first time that nebulae could be discerned clearly through this wonderful telescope. And what he would do is he would observe and then he would draw them. And there's his drawing of a nebula. So at this point, it wasn't possible to photograph it. And then later, people began to be able to take photographs through the telescope. That was a huge advance. And through the early telescopes, this was about as much as you could see. And then nowadays, of course, we're able to see something like that. So that whole science of photography, which, by the way, many of the women of this period sort of became expert in, not just the women, was really added interest to the study of. Okay, I better move along. So what was a nebula? Was it very small or was it very far away? So eventually it was decided that in fact it was very far away. Now the nebula at the time, even though it was eventually decided that they were in fact not just tiny little clusters of stars or gas, that they were in fact complex arrangements of planets and stars, there was still a reluctance to recognize that they were other galaxies. And this had to do, of course, with the whole Victorian notion of religion and the fact that we had one universe, it had been created by God, and to question that. Although she had no problem at all with science and evolution and all of that, she still held fast to the one universe theory. And in fact, it wasn't until 1925, after something called the Great Debate, that it was recognized that these, in fact, were separate galaxies to our own. So just take a look at the chapters in A Popular History of Astronomy in the 19th century. Once again, at 35, I mean, I can barely read it, let alone, encompass the erudition that it took to write a book like that and to make it readable. And that was her real genius. In fact, she wasn't really an astronomer. She was a science writer. She understood, she synthesized, and she wrote it in a way that was eminently accessible. Now, after the publication, she really became part of the mainstream life of 19th century astronomy, and she became lifelong friends with several very, very eminent astronomers. One of them was Richard Holden. He was American, and he'd been in touch with her even before publication, and she acknowledged his help in the book. He was president of the University of California, and he was director of the Lick Observatory. He was her first and most important contact with America, and through him came a long line of other contacts and friendships. She was tremendously impressed with the resources that the Americans could command and with their energy. And she felt that, in fact, British astronomy in comparison was a bit of a quiet backwater. But in turn, American astronomers came to rely on her to disseminate their findings and propagate their findings in Britain. Here's another one who became a lifelong friend. This is Norman Lockyer. Norman, I have learned about from another context because he was, in fact, one of the earliest archaeoastronomers doing a lot of work on stone alignments and stone circles in Scotland. He was also the founding editor of the journal Nature, and he had her write for Nature up to a certain point. There was a breach. She never fell out with him, but she fell out with nature, and I'll tell you why in a moment. He was, by the way, a great influence on Boyle Summerville, our earliest archaeoastronomer, whom we visited on the field trip on Thursday. Her next greatest friend was Margaret Huggins, another Irish woman, Margaret Murray from Monkstown. Margaret became her greatest friend and intellectual companion from then. She was the one who wrote an appreciation of her and Ellen after she died. William and Margaret, William was her husband, William Huggins. They worked as a team. Everything was published, of course, under his name. And they later became Sir William and Lady Huggins. He was one of the founders of spectroscopy, and she became an expert in photographing the results. They were a completely formidable team. And one of the accusations leveled against Agnes was that she wasn't a practicing astronomer. She was a science writer, but she didn't, she couldn't possibly really understand all this because she herself was not a practicing astronomer. So this is David Gill. He invited her to his observatory in Cape Town, in the Cape, and off she went. She met him at a Royal Institution lecture. They became instant friends, fast friends for life. This was his astronomy in the Cape and his observatory, and she went off. She spent several months there, and she had a wonderful time. And she had many adventures on the boat, going and coming as well. And here's a picture of her there. This is Agnes. You probably recognize her by now. Here she is, and here they all are. He gave her several sort of discrete tasks to do while she was there, and she accomplished those and had a wonderful time doing it. Now, when she got back, she was offered a post as a lady computer at Greenwich, and this was actually the only job open to women in astronomy at the time. It was very badly paid and quite menial, and it was about recording and doing the mathematical computations and writing down everything the male astronomers said and all the rest of it. And but to make it a bit tempting for her, they offered her the use of one of the telescopes in her off time. It was far beneath her abilities, but she had to turn it down. It involved walking through Greenwich Park at night in the dark, and there had been some attacks on women. Her mother was her parents were becoming frail. She didn't want to be away from home. But the lady computers, here's a bunch of them at Harvard. Some of them did go on to become eminent astronomers in their own rights. Holden got a hold of her too and offered her a job becoming professor of astronomy at Vassar University, which is the famous college for women in the States. And she, of course, had to turn that down as well. It was much more suited to her abilities than being a lady computer would have been. Maria Mitchell, seen there with her students, she had trained as an astronomer in the Navy and went on to run this program in Vassar, and in fact produced several very eminent women historians. Now, her second book came out around now. This was The System of the Stars, and she dedicated it to her father, and her father he died just before the book was published. And I find that very poignant. He was her first teacher, really, and a very, very encouraging support of all his life of her and her work. Here's just a quote from The System of the Stars, and the reason I put this quote in is to illustrate that she really, as most astronomers were at the time, she really was wedded to this idea there was one galaxy, one system of the stars. And as I said, it wasn't until 1925 that was overturned anyway. Now, the Royal Astronomical Society was kind of like the Holy Grail of astronomy in Britain at the time. And women were not eligible to be members of the Royal Astronomical Society. Now, Mary Summerville and Caroline Herschel had been elected as honorary members about 70 years before, and since then no other women had ever been admitted. But about 1890, some women's names were put forward, and one of the women that was put forward was this woman, Elizabeth Brown, who had her own observatory. She had married somebody very rich. He conveniently died, left her a bunch of money, and she followed her lifelong passion and became an astronomer. Her specialty was solar activity. She was a remarkable scholar, but she was turned down. And this created quite a furor in the scientific community, quite a bit of bad feeling. And so it was decided, as a result of that the president, at his discretion, could issue cards of admission to talks to qualified candidates. And Agnes and Ellen both applied and were instantly accepted and regularly attended. And I love the description that's given at one of these talks, that Agnes was in the front row, and the convener of the talk had to say, "Now, gentlemen, please, 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 please be seated," because she was surrounded by astronomers asking her opinion, bringing her new ideas, saying, "Could we meet afterwards? Can I have an..." And because she was the one they depended upon. They couldn't write the way she could, so that regular people, they couldn't popularize and make accessible their own research, but she could. But it wasn't just that. It was the depth of understanding that she brought as a real scientist. She was incredibly respected by that, with one exception, as you'll see. Now, because women, and basically nobody but gentlemen could be admitted to the Royal Astronomical Society. You had to be sort of independently wealthy, really. A new organization was founded called the British Astronomical Association. And it was completely democratic. Anybody could join. And it's still going strong at this point. And Agnes and Ellen joined immediately. It was founded by very eminent people. It was founded by the Hugginses, Sir Charles and Lady Huggins, her great friend, and also by Maunder, who was the director of the Greenwich Observatory that had offered her the job as the lady computer. Now, just an aside, Maunder, who was a widower, married one of the lady computers. Her name was Annie Russell, and she was from Strabane in County Tyrone. I see a northern man nodding there. And she then became known as Annie Maunder, and she became an expert photographer of the heavens. And she really wrote all the stuff that was published under his name. It couldn't be published under her name, unfortunately. She was forced to resign her job upon marriage, which is an interesting thing. One of the things that was a real advantage for Agnes is that she was not married. She had her own legal status, and she didn't have to publish under anybody else's name. Another man who became, this is Annie Maunder, another man who became a big friend and supporter, he was kind of a child prodigy, really. He was very young in this picture, was George Ellery Hale. He was another American. He was a new acquaintance. He was to remain a strong supporter and friend for life. He was very brilliant, very young. He had a meteoric rise to fame, and he became the director of the Wilson Observatory, and he studied sunspots. Now, another male bastion, the Royal Institution for Excellence, the Royal Society, the Royal Society for Excellence in Science. They were, of course, women couldn't join, but they made the concession that they could be invited as guests, and Agnes never missed never lacked an institution. And you think that times have moved on. Well, this picture of the same group was taken in 1954. They are now very open and democratic. They started to admit women in 1948, but I can't see any in that picture, can you? No? Okay, so the Royal Institution was another institution. It was established as a kind of public education service to deliver lectures to the public. And women regularly attended these lectures. And in 1893, they awarded her the Actonian Prize. Now, as you can see, the criteria for the prize. It had to do with, really science and religion going hand in hand. But it was only £100. She bought a piano with it, you'll be pleased to hear. But it was incredibly prestigious. It was a real coup that she was awarded this. Here are some of the other people who were awarded the Actonian Prize in their time. You have Marie Curie, Lord and Lady Huggins, or Sir, what's his name in Huggins, Edward Hale, and that's, who knows who that is? The guy, Alexander Fleming, the penicillin man. So that's the company that she is now in. Now, she was getting a bit tired of astronomy, so for relaxation, she wrote this book. With her own original translations from the Greek, I might add, of course. Her next book was about the Herschels. It was called The Herschels in Modern Astronomy. William and Caroline Herschel had never been given her due. She herself described herself as a bit of a handmaiden to her brother William, but in fact she was brilliant and did an enormous amount of work with him and for him. She never had a biographical sketch before, and Agnes really wanted to do this, planned it for a long time, went to the Herschels and had access to all of their original material. Another coup at the time. This is a man called James Dewar, Sir James Dewar. He's at the Royal Institution, and he was the cryogenics man, the one who had he solidified oxygen and hydrogen and oxygen by means of deep freezing. And he was awarded something called the Hodgkins Trust Prizes. And you can see, by the way, that the audience at the Royal Institution includes men and women, and they're all dressed up in dinner jackets and finery for this lecture. So it was quite a thing in Victorian London to do this kind of thing. And she was chosen to write the essay describing this experiment, which was completely out of the realm of her normal writing, but she took it on and she did a magnificent job, just to show you, once again, the breadth. Her next challenge, she met Leslie Stephen, who was the author and founder of the Dictionary of National Biography, the DNB, and who knows who was his daughter? Yes, Virginia Woolf, exactly. And her entries in that, as I said, they're numerous. All the entries of 19th century astronomers were done by her. And she was also consulted by one of my heroes, Alfred Wallace. Alfred Wallace was the one who independently came to the conclusions about natural selection, along with Darwin, and put a bit of a spanner in the works when he wrote to Darwin and said, "These are my theories. I thought you'd like to know." And Darwin said, "Oh my God, I'm about to give this lecture about the theory of evolution, and this man has done it before me." Anyway, I better move on. Her next book was Problems in Astrophysics. She considered this her magnum opus. It was a giant piece of research laying out what was known, but what also still needed investigation. 600 pages with diagrams and photographs. And it was very well received, except by the journal Nature. And remember I said there was a break with the journal Nature, and that she had, this great support from the scientific community. Well, the exception now is the very nasty reviewer Richard Gregory, and here's what he wrote. "A man who has had scientific training can quickly grasp the essential points of progress. Agnes Clerke should remember that passengers are respectfully requested not to speak to the man at the wheel." He also added, "It is a characteristic of women to make rash assertions, and in the absence of contradiction, to accept them as true. Miss Clerke is apparently not free from this weakness of her sex." And later, when he was reviewing the second edition of her System of the Stars, he said, the intuitive instinct of a woman is a safer guide to follow than her reasoning faculties. So how do we feel about Richard Gregory? All right, well, at this point, having published this, the Royal Astronomical Society could no longer ignore her claim to public recognition, and she and Margaret Huggins were elected as honorary members, the first scientist to be elected in 70 years. Now, her next book was Modern Cosmogonies, taken from a series of articles for Journal Knowledge. Around this time, her beloved sister Ellen. I could do a whole lecture on Ellen. I haven't been able to talk about her at all, just due to time, but she suddenly died in 1906. They were all very devout Catholics, and this is a quote from her book at that time. She really did see the hand of the Almighty in everything she studied. She followed the following year, 1907, exactly the same way as Ellen. She got a flu, it turned into pneumonia, and she passed away very quickly. This is the mass card that I found in the 4 books in the Heritage Centre that Philip O'Regan very kindly brought out and let me photograph. So, since then, she kind of went out of our knowledge. She kind of disappeared from history for a while. But of course, with the growth of feminism and the insistence that, yes, there were women astronomers, and they were just as clever and just as hardworking and just as eminent as the men, she finally started to find some recognition. The Clerke crater on the moon was named for her in 1981. It's on the border of the Sea of Serenity, close to where Apollo 12 landed. And the Royal Astronomical Society founded a prize in her name, and the first recipient was only in 2017. And this is a big thrill for me because the first recipient is Dr. Clive Ruggles. And Clive Ruggles is one of the leading astronomers, direct descent from, intellectual descent from Norman Lockyer and from our own down the road neighbour, Boyle Summerville. And he will be Clive will be at a day-long seminar on archaeoastronomy that Robert and I are attending in September. So I must congratulate him on his Agnes Clerke Prize. And of course, you know that once you've been the subject of street art, you've really arrived. And I encourage you to take a look at the street art at the moment devoted to both Agnes and Ellen in Ballydehob. So, in Skibbereen, sorry. So, just to recap one more time about this, the fact that she grew up in Skibbereen during the famine, same time as O'Donovan Rossa. They bookend Bridge Street. His portrait is on one end at O'Leary Jewellers, where he used to trade as a seed merchant, and hers, Ellen and Agnes, of course, on the other end of Bridge Street at what used to be now La Femme Beauty Salon. Both extremely different in their politics. To the end, the Clerkes remained strong unionist, feeling that now that Catholic emancipation had been won, Ireland was better off within the empire. Of course, O'Donovan Rossa felt exactly the opposite. But I think that they were both products of their time, and both wanted what they perceived to be the best for Ireland. Here's the street art. This one's in Cork. This one is up at the entrance to the Skibbereen Market now. And as for Miss Clerke, I went in and I said to her, you must be connected. And you know what she said to me? No relationship whatsoever. Completely different family. So I just want to end by saying that I've had wonderful support from this book by Mary Brooke, which is still available online, a very comprehensive biography. There's 2 articles, one by Perry O'Donovan and the other by, where are my notes, in the Skibbereen Journal. I've had great help from Philip O'Regan at the Skibbereen Heritage Centre, and as I said, access to the DC archives from Kira DC, who opened up her home and this box of material. So I hope you've enjoyed learning about Agnes and that she's become one of your new heroines.